Chapter 4. The wide boulevard that ran parallel to the park was filled with sounds and lights, despite the late hour. A few restaurants were still open, waiters too timid to shoo the few lingering patrons back onto the streets. Through the windows, one could see solitary souls dallying over the scraps on their plates, reluctant to complete their night out on the town and slink back to dark and desolate rooms in hopes of a few hours of troublesome sleep. The protagonist trudged along at a steady pace, pausing briefly in front of an otherwise nondescript building that caught his interest. While it bore no sign or identification on its facade, each time the building's blackened doors opened, deep indigo and green flashes of light, as well as sidewalk-shaking sounds of industrial music, leaked out onto the sidewalk. A line of stylish people, almost a block in length, waited patiently for their chance inside the club. Angry young men, dapper in the latest fashion trends and with immaculately coiffed hair, stood in groups near clusters of young women, scantily clad in sparkly gowns, heavy makeup, and uncomfortable heels. No one in this queue was passé enough to hide their stylish clothes and fit young bodies within the confines of a jacket or a heavy sweater. The girls shivered in the cold, damp air and tried to warm themselves with their breath and their hands. The protagonist was chilled even under his overcoat and hat, and felt a tinge of pity for their discomfort. "What are you looking at?" one girl shouted at him. "Pervert!" shouted another. The protagonist quickly resumed his walk. Half hidden behind the line of partygoers in an adjacent doorway, he could just make out the silhouette of a person lying face down on the floor, in tattered and mud-stained clothing, with a newspaper covering their head. Some unidentifiable fluid was leaking onto the sidewalk from underneath the body. The person did not appear to be breathing. The lively commercial district the protagonist traversed lasted only a few blocks, and consisted mostly of rows of now-closed storefronts, shuttered with secure metal grates, pulled down over big glass windows, filled with bright signs announcing sales and exciting new products. Almost every light post and telephone pole was covered with ragged and faded posters, still valiantly struggling to entice readers to come see a band or a stage production that had occurred months ago. Soon, as the avenue began winding up a hill, the stores and restaurants gave way to a series of residential buildings. These appeared more modern than some of the antiquated architecture found in other parts of the city, albeit with little in the way of ornamentation or flourish to distinguish them from one another in any appreciable way. Some graffiti randomly peppered doorways and newspaper boxes, possibly added by nameless residents to tell their home apart from their neighbors. The scrawls were often in the form of inscrutable ciphers, understandable only to their author. But the protagonist did read the words, "No one is coming to save you," that someone had legibly scratched into a plywood board covering a broken and abandoned doorway. The abandoned house offered him its black heart through its open windows, but the protagonist instead quickly hurried away. At the very top of the low hill was a monument, encircled by a smattering of park benches that were in turn interspersed with some small patches of unkempt greenery. The monument consisted of a singular granite obelisk that stood twice as high as the protagonist himself. He approached it out of curiosity. Large brass letters that read, "To our glorious dead," had once been hammered into the front side. However, several of the letters had long since fallen out and been lost, leaving behind only shallow, ghostly scars in the granite to mark their absence. The reverse side of the obelisk displayed several brass plaques, weathered a deep forest green with age, that acknowledged the heroic deeds of local citizens who had been killed in some now forgotten war. On the ground next to the plaques, someone had lain a wreath, consisting primarily of red cloth, formed into the shape of poppies, bound to a wire backing. The wreath had fallen over, or been blown over, into a small puddle left from yesterday's rain. The cloth flowers were faded and stained with mud and soot from the passing cars. The protagonist picked up the soggy memorial and leaned it against the monument in the most dignified manner he could. It dripped reddish liquid. The protagonist then sat on a bench opposite the memorial and contemplated. An occasional car passed by, its headlights causing the obelisk's shadow to rapidly sweep across the greenery like the hand of a clock. He considered the names etched on the memorial's plaque. Men, once made of living flesh and filled with dreams and hopes of the future, now reduced to nothing more than a list of half-illegible names on a tarnished stone in a park few people visited. And someday, like Ozymandias, even the stone would crumble into ruin and obscurity. The obelisk's shadow swept past him on several more circuits. On the other hand, he thought to himself, war or not, was this not the eventual fate of us all? Whether blown to pieces on a battlefield defending a flag, or quietly expiring in bed surrounded by weepy grandchildren, all flesh is inexorably reduced to such poverty. If that was a fundamental truth, it could be argued that any noble cause, even one that was not objective and eternal, presented as good of a reason to die as any other. In the absence of eternal and objective meaning, couldn't any temporary, subjective meaning suffice? To give your life in service of something bigger than yourself, he thought. At least I wouldn't have to die alone. The obelisk's shadow kept sweeping around past the protagonist, counterclockwise with every passing car. To be one with a multitude of others who's dedicated themselves to the same call to arms. He sunk deeper into the bench. The cars passed rhythmically one after another, engines purring. In the downtime between their passing, one could faintly hear the bass emanating from the club blocks away. He watched the shadows sweep by with narrowed eyes. A large explosion rattled the ground and woke him from his torpor. Some loose stones and mud spattered down from above, but he was still safe, protected by the sandbags and wood barricades piled up on the top of the trench. He instinctively reached for the rifle he religiously kept by his side. As the dust settled, he could see the sky above him, gray and clouded and teeming with barrage balloons. Puffs of black smoke occasionally drifted overhead, bringing with them the acrid scent of gunpowder and hot metal, and blood. A tricolored flag hung limp and dead from the top of a makeshift pole. He adjusted his helmet, and his eyes started to come into focus. Soldiers from the protagonist's regiment loitered in crouched positions all around him. Some were seemingly oblivious to the barrage raining from above. Others cowered with a grimace of terror permanently etched on their faces. 2 sergeants continued to nonchalantly play cards over a makeshift table. Propped up alongside them was the body of a lifeless private, open-mouthed with rigor mortis, and staring blankly at the sky with dead, vacant eyes. The midsection of the private's uniform was stained black, and his feet were bare and unmuddied. Someone, presumably as a morbid joke, had placed a hand-painted wooden sign in the dead man's lap that read, "Private Boots, R.I.P." The protagonist didn't recognize the dead man. Was that his name? Boots? He said. "We never got his name," replied the first sergeant. "He wasn't here long enough. And can't read his name tag now. Fool got it all full of holes. Gonna have to give him a demerit for that," said the second sergeant. "But the poor sap was kind enough to deliver me these new boots," said the first sergeant. "He even went to the trouble to break him in for me." The protagonist noticed that the sergeant was wearing the dead man's shoes. The 2 gruff veterans laughed and went back to their cards. Another shell exploded somewhere overhead, raining pebbles and dirt onto the soldiers below. There was naught to do until the shelling subsided, or the regiment received new orders. So the protagonist and the other men just sat and huddled and did their best to keep dry. Occasionally, messengers ran back and forth along the trench, ferrying unknown commands between faceless officers hidden away in unseen underground bunkers. A light, greasy rain started to fall. A pair of orderlies passed by carrying a stretcher that held someone covered by a sheet. Only the wounded man's hand was visible as it dangled limply off the edge, nails filthy with black mud. The orderlies trudged along at a slow and methodical pace, implying that they held no hope that the man on the stretcher could be saved. A corporal rocked back and forth with closed eyes, tightly clutching a rosary and murmuring something that was only audible to himself and his God. Low conversations could be heard in the distance. From his vantage point in the trench, the protagonist could glimpse shells flying overhead in both directions. Considering the extensive range of modern cannons, not to mention the fog and smoke obscuring the battlefield, he assumed that there was no possibility that the artillerymen firing the shells could see their intended targets, or if they were true to their mark. They may not have had a specific target at all. They followed orders, loaded round after round, pulled the firing lanyard, and watched as the shells flew off into the clouds. An artilleryman in this nightmare surely would have to assume that they had killed an enemy soldier, at least sporadically, but they'd never know with certainty. They'd never know if their actions helped turn the tide of the battle or were completely ineffectual. They'd never know whose death they caused, or anything about their victim. Left with nothing more than the assumption, or the hope, that those torn apart by the shrapnel were, to some degree, less than human. The protagonist scrambled for a safer position between two piles of soiled sandbags left over from some now forgotten construction. He found himself back to back with a young private who'd sought refuge in the same place. The private barely noticed the protagonist's presence at first. He was preoccupied with something in his hands. It was a photograph. "Look at her," the private said to him. "Isn't she a real basket of oranges? And a real hellcat, too, let me tell you." The protagonist agreed that she was very winsome. "She waiting for you back home?" he asked. "Sure is. The day I shipped out, she told me she'd be true till the end of time. We're going to get married as soon as this war is over. I write her every day." "Does she ever write back?" "I'm sure she does. She promised she'd write every day. It's hard for letters to get delivered here, you know. But I bet that when I rotate back to headquarters, there'll be a whole pile of letters waiting for me, scented with fancy perfume." Something in the tenor of his voice implied that he wasn't sure of the truth of his assertion. The protagonist felt it was appropriate to be encouraging. "I bet there'll be some cookies, and another photograph too," he said. The private smiled sadly. "With a great girl like that back home, what made you enlist and come all the way out here to this blasted hellscape?" The private looked at him quixotically. "What other choice did we have? This is important. If we don't hold the line here, they'll press on and invade our homes. I thought about what those brutes would do if they ever got their grubby hands on—" The private hesitated. "I mean, we just can't throw up a white flag and let those devils over there just take whatever they want, right?" "No, I suppose we can't," replied the protagonist. They sat without talking for some time after that. "Hey, buddy, do you got a girl waiting for you back home?" asked the private. "I'm not sure. For some reason, I can't remember clearly right now. Maybe I'm just a bit shell-shocked." "Well, I know why I'm here. If you're not protecting someone special back home, what are you doing here?" Just then, a large shell exploded somewhere very close by and caused a part of the earthen barricade to subside and collapse. While no one was injured, a pair of newly inducted fusiliers that had been cowering and shivering under a corrugated tin sheet found themselves half buried under the trench wall. The men were completely soaked in cold, dark mud, errant tree roots, and small stones. As they dug themselves out of the mess, one of the card-playing sergeants shouted towards them, "Watch what you're doing with my new boots. I don't want them if they're all dirty." The other sergeant chuckled ghoulishly. The two fusiliers looked blankly at each other. They were now completely black from head to toe, like reverse ghosts. with only their wide, white eyes standing out against the dark, wet mud that covered them completely. The protagonist watched as those white eyes grew and grew with panic. One of the Fusiliers made a break for it. Before anyone could stop him, he scrambled up the partially collapsed trench wall over the top and ran at a full speed away from the enemy and towards the imagined safety of the rear. A short volley of machine gun fire came soon after that, but no one in the trench could see if the fleeing soldier made it or was mercilessly cut down. The protagonist liked to imagine that he made it. The sergeants just shook their heads and went back to their cards. "Dumbass," one murmured to the other. The second Fusilier wandered off down the trench, shell-shocked and shivering, futilely hoping to find something dry with which to clean his face. The protagonist followed. Hey, it's going to be okay," he said to the man. "Let me help you." He gently wiped the man's face with the sleeve of his uniform. "I shouldn't even be here," the man cried out, pushing the protagonist away. He kicked at a half-rotted post in anger and frustration. "You can make it through. Me, you, the rest of the regiment, we're all in this together." "Speak for yourself," the man said dismissively. "I'm only here because Father forced me to enlist, said it would build character. But he assured me that he'd keep me far away from the real fighting, just close enough to be able to brag to the lads at the club. How did I end up in this filthy hole with the rabble?" He shouted to the sky. "Not letting those brutes and devils take whatever they want from us?" the protagonist suggested. The Fusilier did not respond other than to spit on the ground. "I would stab Father in the face right now for a hot bath," he said dismissively, and wandered off. The protagonist sighed and returned to his position between the sandbags. The private who had been clutching the photograph was nowhere to be found, and the protagonist was again left to his own thoughts. Sullen and grim-faced soldiers continually lumbered back and forth through the trench, moving like zombies. None acknowledged the protagonist's presence. In the hopes of establishing a solidarity of joint suffering, he endeavored to make eye contact with each man as they passed, but their eyes were all dead and vacant. He noticed that a reckless rifleman had imprudently stuck his head over the top of the sandbags to catch a glimpse of the enemy. The protagonist rushed to him and dragged him back to safety. "Get down! What are you doing?" he shouted. "Oh, don't worry about me," said the rifleman. "I can't die." "You're mad." The rifleman shook his head. "No, not mad. I'm just immortal. Well, quantum immortal anyway. We all are. It becomes pretty obvious if you think about it. Have you been keeping up on the latest science? I've been reading it in the papers. The new theory from those lads in Copenhagen. They call it quantum superposition. Do you know what that is?" "I have no idea." "It says that if there are two possible outcomes of an event, both are simultaneously true until you look at it. It's like a coin flying through the air. It's not heads or tails until it lands and you look at it. While it's in the air, it's both and neither at the same time." "Well, how does that nonsense stop you from getting your head shot off?" The rifleman thought for a second. "Okay, let me try this another way. Close your eyes and imagine that you're dead. What's it like?" The protagonist closed his eyes and imagined himself lying in a casket in a church. Mourners came and went as colored lights beamed down through stained glass windows. "You're imagining seeing yourself in a casket, right?" "Yes," said the protagonist. "It's a bit relaxing, actually. But see, that vision is wrong. If you're dead, I mean actually totally dead, you can't be there to observe yourself lying in a casket. A soul has no mechanism to observe itself not existing. It's impossible. That's quantum immortality. Say, for example, I ran through this no man's land right now. There'd be a chance I'd get killed, and a chance I'd live. But we don't know which results would happen just yet. It's like the coin spinning in the air. We only would know whether I lived or died once we observe the result, once we look at the coin lying on the ground. But if I'm dead, I can't observe the coin. And if I can't observe it, then quantum physics holds that that specific result can't happen. And if I can't possibly be dead, then I must be alive. So There you go. I mean, according to the latest science, I can never die. That's pretty optimistic, putting your faith in crackpot theories like that, replied the protagonist. What if there were an afterlife, or some other dimension where you could look down on yourself being dead? I don't think that science postulates an afterlife, but hypothetically, if there were a place where you could experience yourself not existing, I guess that would be hell. The rifleman seemed quite convinced of his conjecture, and the protagonist thought it best not to argue further, lest he accidentally disrupt the man's faith. Regardless of the ultimate truth of the rifleman's logic, it seemed to give him comfort, which is something everyone in the regiment, including the protagonist, was in dire need of. Due to the gray, overcast sky and the clouds of gunpowder smoke drifting by, no one in the trench could see the location of the sun. It was impossible to tell how fast or slow time was passing while they waited for the orders. However, at some indeterminate time after the protagonist had discussed quantum superposition with the crazed rifleman, his probability wave collapsed when a pair of officers followed by a platoon of soldiers marched down the trench. They said nothing, but paused momentarily to allow the captain to blow a whistle. They then resumed their march. The sergeants got up from their game of cards. "Okay, boys, you heard the signal. We're going over in 5 minutes. Suit up!" Immediately, it almost seemed as if the very walls of the trench came to life as muddied and filthy soldiers began to stir and emerge from every shadow. They straightened their uniforms as best they could, checked their weapons and ammunition, and lined up in their positions. Ladders were raised against the towering barricades, and the two sergeants took up positions at the head of the column. "Masks!" one of them shouted. The men all donned their gas masks. The protagonist looked around at his compatriots through his rapidly fogging lenses. The soldiers now seemed otherworldly and demonic, a horde of faceless and fleshless wraiths made wholly of rubber, glass, and metal, bodies dripping with dark, wet filth and bristling with armaments. The sergeants peered timorously over the trench wall, waiting for the signal. "Affix bayonets!" All went quiet for seconds, minutes, hours, lifetimes. A large white balloon rose serenely overhead and floated over the trench. Straightaway, the cannon barrage began, loud and fast and hard. The earth rumbled beneath the men's feet. "Forward!" exclaimed the sergeant. The regiment poured forth into no man's land. From his position in the center of the horde, the protagonist witnessed wave after wave of young men climb the ladders and rush headlong into the enemy. Machine gun fire echoed from every direction. When it was his turn, the protagonist was pressed forward by the crush of men behind him, and he had no choice but to climb the ladder. The world between the enemy trench and his own was a scarred, colorless hellscape of mud and fog and barbed wire and bodies. Smoke and souls could be seen rising into the sky all around him. To his left and his right, his compatriots were anonymous and unidentifiable in their identical uniforms. He saw many soldiers blown to pieces or cut down by gunfire before his goggles became too fogged to see anything beyond his own feet. "Forward to glory!" he heard someone shout. He followed the sound of the voice and went forward. His blurred perception seemed to have transformed the men around him. There were riflemen and grenadiers, but now also shining knights in gleaming armor, and winged hussars charging on horseback. Armored tanks squared off against war elephants bristling with archers clad in white linen. Chariots galloped through the broken ground in an attempt to flank a whole phalanx of pikemen. Swarms of spider-like drones leveled an entire detachment of helpless cataphracts with barrages of lasers and railguns. Above the chaos, biplanes and jet fighters and zeppelins and nuclear bombers circled. In the confusion, the protagonist lost sight of his unit, but he pressed on. He looked for familiar faces to guide him, but he was surrounded now only by beasts and monsters, screaming and howling for blood. The protagonist stumbled through the broken wasteland until he tripped over something nauseatingly soft and squishy, and tumbled head first into a deep shell hole, half full of fetid water and rusted metal. As he righted himself, his boots sank knee-deep into the thick mud, binding him in place. His rifle had fallen from his hands and was now lost. He pulled at the walls around him, but the loose, wet soil just gave way as he clawed at it. Above him he could catch glimpses of shadows of soldiers running past, obscured by smoke, yet illuminated in every flash of cannon fire. In the fog of war, no one noticed him trapped beneath their feet in this muddy ditch. A deafening roar of discharging weapons was the only thing he could hear, with any lulls in gunfire being filled with war cries and screams of agony. He tried to catch his breath, but that was not possible within the confines of his ghoulish rubber mask. It was impossible to judge how long the battle raged on, but after a time, the fighting subsided. Artillery fell mostly silent. Gunfire became sporadic. Only the whimpers of the wounded remained. The protagonist wondered if his side had won or lost. There had been no cries of victory, but also no calls to retreat. He thought about the men of his regiment and where they might be. Some were certainly dead. Others undoubtedly had made it to safety. But if the mad rifleman was to be believed, for now they all existed as Schrodinger's cats, simultaneously alive and dead, until their bodies could be retrieved and accounted for. He threw off his mask in an attempt to regain his humanity. Fumes of gunpowder and burning flesh immediately filled his nostrils. Without the myopic goggles obscuring his vision, the first thing he noticed was that the skyline above him was oddly beautiful, now that it was on fire. From his position stuck in the mud, he couldn't see much of the battlefield, but if he contorted his body, he could peer over the crater's brim just enough to see a tricolored flag hanging dead at the top of its pole above the enemy position. The protagonist squinted, but due to the fog or the smoke or some strange trick of the light, he couldn't make out the flag's colors. He lowered himself back into the trench in despair. Bullets continued to zip by overhead intermittently, like flying insects, as those still alive in the trenches opportunistically fired in the direction of any suggestion of movement in the no man's land. He allowed himself to sink further into the mud. Perhaps, once night fell and the rain stopped, he could crawl safely back to his trench unseen. Above him, somewhere out of view, he could make out the sound of labored wheezing. A fellow soldier, wounded and splayed out on the battlefield, struggled to breathe, lungs slowly but inescapably filling with blood. The protagonist could do naught but listen. He couldn't get free of the mud if he tried, and if by some Herculean effort he were somehow able to lift himself up, he would most certainly be cut down by enemy fire well before he could render aid. He told himself that it was likely the man was beyond saving anyway. The sun struggled impotently to shine through the thick fog that descended across the battlefield, yet it provided no warmth to counteract the chill of the mud. The protagonist shivered and wondered how long until nightfall. In the distance, cannons continued to fire indiscriminately. The wounded man above him deprived the protagonist of his solitude by stubbornly continuing to breathe. A delirium had set in, and he began to cry out. He cried out for help. He cried out for his girl. He cried out for his mother. The voice, though labored and muffled, was familiar. It was the private the protagonist had spoken to earlier in the day, the one who'd shown him a photograph of his fiancée back home. If she had sent all those letters he'd claimed she'd sent, he would never get to read them. The protagonist wished he could help the private, or at least be there to comfort him in his final moments. He considered calling out to him, telling him that he was not alone, that he was loved. He considered offering to convey a final message to the man's fiancée. He closed his eyes and imagined a warm and sunny day after the war ended. He was walking up to a modest country house with a yellow ribbon tied around the tree in the front yard. He'd knock on the door and deliver the private's dying words in a blood-stained photograph to the weeping woman. They would exchange a deep bond over their shared trauma. He'd lie and tell her the private was brave and steadfast until the end. However, the protagonist stayed silent in his crater. He did not reveal himself to the wounded private. He simply listened in silence as the man's breathing became more forced and his struggled cries became quieter. Seconds, minutes, hours, lifetimes went by before the private finally went still. He died alone and scared. The sky did not betray the hidden location of the sun behind the clouds and smoke. The protagonist shivered and wondered how much longer until nightfall. He was suddenly roused from his slumber on the memorial bench by a car loudly backfiring as it drove past. He opened his eyes in time to witness the shadow of the obelisk sweep across his face clockwise. He sat up straight and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. He stood up and straightened his rumpled overcoat with his hands as best he could. Before he continued on his journey, he ran his fingers across the brass plaque of the memorial to see if he could find some mention of the private he dreamed of. But he realized he'd never bothered to learn any of his compatriots' names.